***, part of the unraveling, the lady and the mountain man. ***. The wind came first, a low moan through the pines that sounded like a gathering of ghosts. By midday, it was a shriek, tearing at the canvas of the supply wagon and whipping icy needles into the faces of horse and man. Late autumn in the Wyoming high country had turned on them with the vicious speed of a cornered wolf. This was no gentle dusting. It was a white hell, a swirling chaos that erased the trail, the sky, and any sense of direction. Evelyn Hart leaned forward in her saddle, the fine wool of her traveling cloak already stiff with ice. Her face, normally composed and framed by dark hair meticulously pinned, was raw and red from the wind's assault. Beside her, Caleb Finch, all of 17 years but with the earnest grit of a man twice his age, fought to keep his mount steady. He was the last of her escort. The other two, hired men from Cheyenne, had turned back at the first serious sign of the storm, their loyalty as thin as their summer coats. "We should have stopped at the old relay station," Ma'am Caleb shouted, his voice nearly stolen by the gale. Evelyn's reply was lost, a puff of frozen breath. He was right, of course, but stopping was a luxury she couldn't afford. Stopping meant letting Barrett Sloane get closer. The thought of the man, with his predatory smile and his web of lawyers and Pinkerton agents, was a cold far deeper than the blizzard. He was the reason she was here, fleeing Denver, pushing into the teeth of winter with a leather satchel that held her only weapons, the trust documents for her own inheritance, and, more importantly, for her younger sister, Lily. Barrett's plan was as simple as it was vile: marry the widow Hart and, in doing so, gain legal control over her assets and legal guardianship over Lily's substantial trust the moment she turned 18. The law, written by men for men, was on his side. A woman alone, especially a wealthy one, was seen as an untended field, ripe for the claiming. Her horse, a sturdy Morgan named Atlas, stumbled, his breath coming in ragged, steaming plumes. The world was a churning whiteness, and the cold was no longer just on her skin. It was seeping into her bones, a deep, numbing weariness that whispered of surrender. She saw Caleb's shoulders slump. The boy was freezing, his youthful determination no match for the raw power of the mountain. "We need shelter," she yelled, forcing the words out. "Anything, a rock outcropping." But there was nothing, only the endless, suffocating snow. Atlas stumbled again, this time going to his knees. Evelyn was thrown, her landing softened by a deep drift. For a moment, she just lay there, the fight draining out of her. Caleb was off his horse in an instant, struggling through the waist-deep powder to her side. "Mrs. Hart, are you hurt?" She shook her head, but the effort was immense. The precious satchel was still slung across her body, its leather cold against her ribs. "The horse, Caleb." The boy looked at the animal, which was trying weakly to rise, one leg bent at an unnatural angle, his young face crumpled. "His leg's broken. Ma'am, he's done." The finality in his tone was a death knell. Their wagon was miles behind them, likely overturned. Their supplies were on Atlas. Their hope had just snapped like a frozen bone. Caleb helped her to her feet, his own body trembling violently. They huddled together against the wind, two lost souls in a world of white. The temperature was plummeting with the unseen sun. Darkness would come soon, and with it, a sleep from which they would not wake. ***. Jonah Pike didn't curse the storm. To curse the weather was as foolish as cursing a bear for being a bear. He simply accepted it, respected its power, and moved within its rhythms. For 15 years, these mountains had been his only companion, their silence a balm on a soul scorched by the cacophony of war. He'd come here after Appomattox, a man hollowed out by what he'd seen and done, seeking a solitude so profound it might scour his memories clean. He was checking his trap lines, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. his mule, Job, a creature as grizzled and taciturn as himself, followed faithfully. The snow was a bother, covering the tracks of fox and marten, but it was also a cleansing. It made the world new again. He was about to turn back toward his cabin, tucked in a draw sheltered by ancient firs, when Job stopped dead, ears twitching. The mule lifted its head, nostrils flaring, tasting something on the wind that wasn't just snow. Jonah went still, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanning the white blur ahead. He trusted the mule's senses more than his own. He saw it then, a dark shape, nearly buried, a dead horse, and beside it, two smaller shapes, huddled together, barely distinguishable from the drifts. Fools, city fools. By the look of the fine saddle on the dead beast, no one with an ounce of sense would be caught in the high passes this late in the year. His first instinct, a cold and selfish thing born of years alone, was to turn away. It wasn't his trouble. Bringing people into his world meant bringing their noise, their needs, their complications. It meant breaking the hard-won peace he had built, log by painful log. He thought of the iron ring he wore on a leather cord around his neck, tucked beneath his woolen shirt, a memory of a promise, a memory of failure. He had lost people before. He had sworn never to be responsible for another soul again. But he couldn't, the part of him that was a man, the part that hadn't been frozen by grief or isolation, wouldn't let him, with a sigh that plumed in the frigid air. He nudged Job forward. The woman was unconscious, her face alarmingly pale, lashes dark with frost. The boy was barely awake, shivering so hard his teeth chattered like castanets. He looked up at Jonah, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate, flickering hope. "Help her," the boy managed, his voice a dry rasp. Jonah grunted. He dismounted, his movements swift and sure. He felt the woman's neck. The pulse was there, thready but present. He hefted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, all wool and ice. She stirred, a faint moan escaping her lips, and instinctively clutched the satchel at her side. "Get on the mule, boy," Jonah commanded, his voice rough from disuse. "If you can." Somehow, Caleb found the strength to pull himself onto Job's broad back, slumping over the mule's neck. Jonah turned, the woman in his arms, and began the trek back to his cabin, his own tracks already vanishing behind him in the relentless storm. He was breaking his own first rule, stay unentangled, and he knew, with a certainty as cold as the wind, that this single act of kindness would cost him his quiet. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Evelyn awoke to three sensations: the deep, penetrating warmth of a fire, the scratch of a wool blanket against her chin, and the savory smell of stew. She blinked, her eyes struggling to focus. She wasn't in the snow. She was inside, lying on a cot of woven hides. Motes of dust danced in the single beam of gray light from a small, greased paper window. The room was one space, hewn from logs chinked with mud and moss. It was Spartan, but immaculate. Firewood was stacked neatly by a stone hearth where a black pot bubbled. Tools hung from pegs on the wall axes. Saws, skinning knives, all clean and well-oiled. On a rough-hewn table sat a lantern, its glass polished, its wick trimmed. This was the home of a man who lived by his hands, a man who valued order and purpose. A figure sat at the table, his back to her, mending a piece of leather tack. He was broad-shouldered, with hair the color of salt and pepper pulled back in a simple tie. He moved with a quiet focus, his hands calloused and scarred, working with practiced skill. This had to be their rescuer. She pushed herself up, a wave of dizziness washing over her. The satchel was on the floor beside the cot, right where she could reach it. Relief, sharp and immediate, coursed through her. She clutched it to her chest. The movement caught the man's attention. He turned, and she got her first proper look at him. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 40, with a face that was a testament to sun and wind. Deep lines were carved around his eyes and mouth, but his expression wasn't unkind, it was simply neutral, shuttered. He looked at her not as a man looks at a woman, but as one might regard a stray animal brought in from the cold, a problem to be solved. "You're awake," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Caleb is fine, sleeping." He gestured with his head toward another cot in the corner, where the boy lay bundled in furs, his breathing deep and even. "Thank you," Evelyn said, her voice hoarse. "You saved us." He gave a slight nod, accepting her gratitude as a simple fact, not something that required a flowery response. "Storm's not letting up. You'll be here a while." He stood, went to the hearth, and ladled some of the steaming stew into a wooden bowl. He brought it to her. "Eat. You'll need the strength." The stew was thick with venison and root vegetables, and it was the most delicious thing Evelyn had ever tasted. As she ate, her mind began to work again, piecing together their situation. They were stranded, indebted to a stranger in a cabin that felt like it was at the edge of the world. A man who was clearly self-sufficient, but whose solitude felt less like a preference and more like a fortress. "My name is Evelyn Hart," she said between spoonfuls, "and that is Caleb Finch. We were on our way to South Pass City." It was a lie, but a necessary one. She couldn't tell him she was running, couldn't reveal the nature of the wolf at her heels. The man, Jonah Pike, merely grunted. "Bad time of year for it. The pass is likely closed by now." He returned to his table and his leatherwork, the silence stretching between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. It was a strange sort of peace. For the first time in weeks. She wasn't looking over her shoulder. Barrett Sloan and his agents couldn't reach her here. This cabin, this mountain, was a sanctuary forged of ice and isolation. But it was also a cage. She was a woman used to controlling her own destiny, a student of ledgers and contracts who understood the workings of her late husband's mining interests better than any of his managers. She'd fought for her independence, and now she was utterly dependent on a silent stranger. The irony was not lost on her. She felt a prickle of her old pride, the defiance that had made her stand up to Barrett in the first place. "I can pay you for your trouble, Mr. Pike," he supplied, not looking up. "Jonah Pike, and I don't want your money." His tone was flat, dismissive. It wasn't the statement of a proud man, but of a man for whom money had ceased to have meaning. It unsettled her. A man who couldn't be bought was a man who couldn't be predicted. Later, while Jonah was outside tending to his mule, Evelyn saw her chance. She pulled out the oilskin-wrapped bundle of papers from her satchel. Her fingers, still numb, fumbled with the ties. There they were, deeds, bank drafts, and the carefully worded trust established by her father for Lily. Proof, truth, and in the wrong hands, a death sentence. As she retied the bundle, the butt of the small Colt revolver she kept tucked in the satchel pressed against her hand. It was a cold comfort, a reminder that she was not entirely helpless. She had learned to shoot after her husband died, another skill deemed unladylike, but one she considered essential. When Jonah came back inside, shaking snow from his coat, his eyes flickered to the satchel in her lap and then back to her face. He didn't say a word, but a silent understanding passed between them. He knew she had a secret, and she knew that he knew. But for now, in the warm, flickering light of the storm lantern, with the blizzard sealing them off from the world, it didn't seem to matter. They were just two survivors, each with their own ghosts, sharing the shelter of a small wooden cabin against the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The simple, unspoken act of his rescue had tied their fates together, and the storm showed no signs of letting go. **, Part 2, Gathering Clouds, the Law's Crooked Hand. **. The storm broke on the third day, leaving the world scoured and silent, draped in a blanket of pristine white that glittered under a pale, apologetic sun. The silence was a physical presence, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the cabin's eaves and the rhythmic thud of Jonah's axe. In this enforced stillness, a fragile routine began to form. Evelyn, her strength slowly returning, took over the mending of their tattered clothes and the careful rationing of their salvaged food. Her movements precise and economical. She found a strange comfort in the simple, domestic tasks, a stark contrast to the complex world of ledgers and legal battles she had fled. For Caleb, the cabin was a revelation. He shadowed Jonah with a devotion that was almost reverent. The boy, who had known only the dusty streets of Denver, was mesmerized by the mountain man's quiet competence. He watched, wide-eyed, as Jonah showed him the right way to split a log. Not with brute force, but with an understanding of the wood's grain, the axe rising and falling in a single, perfect arc. He learned to read the subtle calligraphy of tracks in the snow, the delicate two-step of a doe, the heavier, purposeful tread of an elk, the menacing drag of a wolf's paw. Everything out here tells a story. "Boy," Jonah said one afternoon, his voice a low rumble. He pointed to a gnawed branch near a copse of aspen. Rabbit was here, frightened. See how he bolted? Something spooked him, something bigger. Caleb's admiration was a palpable thing, and it seemed to chip away at the edges of Jonah's reserve. The man was still sparing with his words, but a different quality entered his silence when the boy was near. It was the patience of a teacher, a quiet approval in his eyes when Caleb finally mastered the swing of the axe or successfully set a snare. For the first time in 15 years, Jonah felt the ghost of a connection, an unfamiliar warmth in the cold fortress of his solitude. It was a feeling he neither trusted nor welcomed, yet it persisted, persistent as a winter weed. After a week, their supplies ran perilously low. The venison stew was gone, and they were down to a handful of dried beans and the last of the flour. Jonah knew he couldn't put it off any longer. He had to go into the nearest settlement, Argent, a fading mining town some 10 miles down the valley. "I'll be gone the day," he announced at dawn, pulling on his heavy coat. "Stay inside. Bolt the door. Don't light the lantern till full dark." Evelyn approached him, her purse in her hand. "Let me pay for the supplies. Mr. Pike, it's the least I can do." He looked at the coin she offered, then at her face. It was the second time she'd offered him money. "Your coin's no good here. Mrs. Hart," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The mountain provides what I need. What it doesn't, I trade for—" He slung a pack over his shoulder. "A few prime marten pelts tied to the side. Just stay put." The trip to Argent was an assault on his senses, after the profound quiet of his valley. The town felt loud, its single muddy street crowded with the ghosts of a silver boom that had long since gone bust. A few grizzled prospectors, their face etched with disappointment, loitered outside the saloon. The air smelled of stale beer, coal smoke, and desperation. As Jonah tethered Job outside the general store, he felt a familiar unease. This was the world he had left behind, a world of men driven by greed and ambition. He noticed them immediately. 2 men, bundled in city-bought coats that were too clean for this part of the country, stood near the telegraph office. They weren't miners or trappers. They had the hard, watchful eyes of men who were paid to look for trouble. Pinkertons, or something like them. His instincts, honed in the crucible of war, screamed at him. Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of coffee, leather, and chewing tobacco. He traded his pelts for flour, salt, coffee, and bacon. The storekeeper, a man named Silas, weighing each item with practiced slowness. It was then that Jonah saw it, nailed to the community board next to an advertisement for patent medicine. It was a notice, printed on crisp legal paper that stood out from the faded flyers around it. The heading was stark ***, civil warrant. His eyes scanned the text, his heart growing cold and heavy in his chest. It named one ***, Evelyn Hart ***, late of Denver, accusing her of embezzling a significant sum from the estate of her deceased husband. But it was the second charge that made his blood run cold. ***, abduction of a minor ***. 1. Caleb Finch, an indentured servant in her employ. The notice was signed by a circuit judge and authorized by Barrett Sloan, acting as executor of the Hart estate. It was a lie, crafted with the devil's own cunning. Barrett had twisted the law into a weapon, painting Evelyn not as a victim fleeing for her freedom, but as a thief and a kidnapper. The charge involving Caleb was the master stroke. It would turn public sentiment against her in an instant and give any lawman the authority to pursue her with righteous vigor. As Jonah stared at the paper, absorbing the full, venomous scope of Barrett's plan, a man cleared his throat behind him. He turned to see a deputy's star pinned to a worn vest. The man was young, with an honest face that was currently clouded with uncertainty. "You're the mountain man, Pike, ain't you?" the deputy asked. His name was Bradley. Jonah gave a curt nod. Deputy Bradley shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. He held a folded copy of the warrant in his hand. "Sheriff Cole's over in Cheyenne for the week. Mr. Sloan. Well, he's a very influential man. He's put up a reward." He gestured vaguely at the notice. "I've been tasked with making inquiries. Seen a woman and a boy pass this way richly dressed, likely looking for passage east." Jonah's face was a stone mask. He thought of Evelyn, her quiet dignity, and Caleb, with his earnest, trusting eyes. He thought of the satchel she guarded so closely, not filled with stolen money. He was now certain, but with the proof of her innocence. "Haven't seen anyone," Jonah said, his voice flat. "Storm kept folks hunkered down." Bradley searched his face, looking for a crack, a flicker of deceit. He found nothing. "Right," the deputy sighed, looking unconvinced. He glanced down at the official paper in his hand, and for a second, Jonah saw a flash of disgust in the young man's eyes. The seal of the court seemed hastily pressed, the ink slightly smeared. It was legal, but it didn't feel right, and they both knew it. "Well, if you do, the law requires you to report it." "I know the law," Jonah said quietly. He paid Silas for his goods, packed them into his saddlebags, and left the store without another word. The weight of the deputy's gaze on his back. The ride back to the cabin was a journey through his own soul. The easy choice, the safe choice, was to turn them over. He could ride back into Argent, tell Bradley where they were, and collect the reward. Sloan would get what he wanted, and the silence of the mountains would be his again. His peace would be restored, but he knew it would be a poisoned peace, a quiet filled with the shame of his betrayal. He remembered the iron ring around his neck. It was half of a set, a simple band he and his wife, Sarah, had hammered out of a horseshoe before he went to war. She and their boy had been taken by fever while he was away fighting for a cause he no longer understood. He had failed to protect them. The solitude he had cultivated for 15 years wasn't just about peace. It was a penance, a way to ensure he would never fail anyone again, by never letting anyone get close enough to need him. Now, 2 strangers had been dropped into his life by a blizzard, and the world was demanding he fail them, too. When he reached the cabin, the sun was low, painting the snow in shades of orange and purple. He walked inside without a word, dropping the supplies on the table. Evelyn and Caleb looked up, their faces etched with worry. They could feel the change in him, the cold draft of the outside world he had brought back with him. He stood by the hearth for a long moment, watching the flames. Then he turned, his face grim. "Your Mr. Sloan has been busy," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. He told her everything, the Pinkertons, the warrant, the accusations. He watched her face as he spoke. She didn't cry or protest. She simply paled, her chin lifting in a gesture of defiance that he was beginning to recognize. "The ledger in my satchel refutes every claim of embezzlement," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And Caleb, he is not an indentured servant. He is my ward. His parents died in a mine collapse. I promised his mother I would see him educated and cared for. Barrett is twisting everything." Jonah nodded slowly. He had already known it was a lie. The question was what he was going to do about it. The law of the land, bought and paid for by men like Barrett Sloane, said he should turn her in. But there was another law, an older one, written on the heart, the law of conscience. He looked at Caleb, who was watching him with absolute faith. He looked at Evelyn, whose pride was a shield for her fear. And he made his choice. "They'll be back," he said. "The deputy was testing the waters. When he reports back, Sloane will send his own men. This cabin won't hold them off for long." He walked over to a large wooden chest in the corner and lifted the heavy lid. From inside, he pulled out a worn, rolled-up piece of buckskin. He spread it on the table. It was a hand-drawn map of the surrounding mountains, etched with details only a man who had walked every inch of them would know. "We can't go back the way you came," he said, his finger tracing a faint line through a cluster of jagged peaks. "They'll be watching the main trails. But there's another way." His finger stopped at a narrow, winding gap between two formidable mountains. Old Crow Pass. It's an old Ute trail. Dangerous this time of year. But it's the last place they'll think to look. A new light shone in Evelyn's eyes, not just hope, but the sharp glint of a strategist recognizing a viable plan. "Where does it lead?" "To the high meadows. From there, we can get to Ruth Henderson's place. She's a midwife, lives about 20 miles south. She's trustworthy." They began to prepare at once, a silent, focused energy filling the small cabin. They packed light food, blankets, Jonah's rifle, and Evelyn's small Colt, which she now carried openly. They were just strapping the last of the bedrolls when the sound came the crunch of footsteps in the snow. Too many for one person. Jonah blew out the lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness lit only by the faint glow of the banked fire. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the door, peering through a small crack. It was Deputy Bradley, his horse a ghostly shape behind him. He was alone. But Jonah could sense other men waiting just beyond the clearing. Hidden in the trees, the trap was set. Bradley dismounted and walked slowly toward the cabin, his boots leaving dark prints in the moonlit snow. He stopped 20 feet from the door, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, not in threat, but in a gesture of weary resignation. "Mrs. Hart," he called out, his voice tight. "I have a warrant for your arrest. I have to ask you to come out peaceably." "Inside?" Caleb stifled a gasp. Evelyn stood frozen, her hand on the satchel. Jonah remained at the door, a silent, immovable shadow. He slowly opened the door and stepped out, holding the heavy rifle loosely at his side. He didn't raise it. He just stood there, a mountain of a man blocking the way. "She's not going with you, Deputy," Jonah said, his voice calm and lethal. Bradley looked at Jonah, then at the dark, silent cabin behind him. He was a young man caught between a powerful man's orders and his own sense of right and wrong. He took a deep breath, his duty warring with his conscience. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. Then, Bradley's gaze flickered past Jonah, toward the dark, forbidding shapes of the mountains to the north. His voice dropped so low it was almost carried away by the wind. "Sloane's men are combing all the main trails," he said, not looking at Jonah, "but at the snow. The South Fork toward Cheyenne is watched heavy, just so you know." He held Jonah's gaze for one final second, a silent, desperate message passing between them. Then, without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back into the darkness. His footprints in the snow were a stark reminder of how close the law had come, but his whispered words were a gift, a small act of courage that had just given them their only chance. Jonah stepped back inside and bolted the door. The immediate danger had passed. "Get your things," he said, his voice urgent. We leave now. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 3. The title scene. Will you be my husband for one day? Asterisk, asterisk. The journey through Old Crow Pass was a trial of ice and will. They moved like ghosts through a landscape of frozen rock and deep, treacherous snowdrifts, following a path that existed more in Jonah's memory than on any map. He led them with a grim, relentless focus, his silence a shield against the biting wind and the ever-present fear of pursuit. Evelyn, pushed to the limits of her endurance, found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She thought of Lily, of Barrett's smug, possessive smile, and she pushed on. Caleb, though tired and cold, moved with a quiet determination, his eyes fixed on Jonah's back as if the man himself were a beacon. They arrived at Ruth Henderson's homestead under the cover of a moonless night, exhausted to the bone. The place was little more than a sturdy cabin and a small barn nestled in a valley that felt a world away from everything. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, a fragile signal of life in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Ruth Henderson was a woman carved from the same tough timber as the mountains themselves. Her face was a roadmap of a long life, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. She took in the sight of the three half-frozen figures on her doorstep, the grim mountain man she'd known for years, the pale, exhausted city woman, and the boy shivering beside them with a calm that bordered on unnerving. "Figured you'd be along. Jonah," she said, her voice raspy but kind. "Heard there was trouble down in Argent. Get inside before you freeze solid." The warmth of her cabin was a physical blow, a wave of blessed relief that made Evelyn's knees weak, while Ruth bustled about, preparing hot broth and tending to Caleb's blistered feet. Evelyn's mind was racing. This small, warm cabin was a temporary haven, not a solution. The warrant was still out there. Legally, she was a fugitive. Barrett's men would not stop. Deputy Bradley's warning had bought them time. Nothing more. She watched Jonah as he spoke quietly with Ruth, his back to the fire. He was a man of the wild, a man who understood the laws of nature, but she was a creature of a different world, a world governed by papers and judges and the crooked statutes that men like Barrett Sloane used as weapons. She needed a different kind of shield, one forged not of buckskin and steel, but of ink and law. The idea had been a flicker at first, a desperate, outlandish thought born of sleepless nights. But here, in the relative safety of Ruth's home, it took root. It was radical, unconventional, and utterly terrifying. But it was also, she realized with a chilling certainty, their only logical move. Later that night, after Caleb was asleep in a small loft, Evelyn found Jonah outside, checking on the animals in the barn. The air was frigid, and the stars were scattered across the black sky like chips of ice. The storm lantern he carried cast a small, golden circle of light, a fragile island in the immense darkness. He was running a hand down Job's flank, his touch surprisingly gentle. He looked up as she approached, his face shadowed and unreadable. "You should be sleeping," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I can't," she replied, pulling her cloak tighter. "My mind won't rest. We have a problem. Mr. Pike, a legal one. Your rifle can't solve it." He turned to face her fully, his expression wary. "Go on." "The warrant," she began, her voice steady and measured, the voice she used when explaining a complex financial report. "Barrett's accusations are built on a specific legal premise that I am a woman alone, without a male guardian or protector, in the eyes of the law in this territory. An unmarried woman, particularly a widow, has limited standing. My word against his is not an equal contest. He is an influential man. I am an unescorted woman with a questionable reputation, thanks to his lies." Jonah remained silent, listening. The lantern light caught the hard lines of his face. "If they find us," she continued, "they won't just arrest me. They will take me back. and the law will grant Barrett exactly what he wants: control. He will force the marriage, citing his duty to protect my interests and my sister's. They will call it a respectable union. It will be a cage. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air burning her lungs. This was it, the moment she laid her mad proposal at his feet. There is a way to challenge that premise, to change my legal standing in a way that even Barrett's crooked judges cannot easily dismiss. A way to give me a protector in the eyes of the law. Who is not him? Jonah's eyes narrowed slightly. He still said nothing, but she could feel the coiled tension in him, the stillness of a predator that has scented something unexpected on the wind. "I need a husband, Mr. Pike," she said, the words falling baldly into the frozen air between them. A flicker of something disbelief, perhaps even anger, crossed his face. "You've come to the wrong man. Mrs. Hart, I'm not the marrying kind." His voice was rough, final. "I am not asking for a marriage," she countered, her own voice rising with an urgency she couldn't suppress. "I am asking for a legal contract, a shield, a temporary arrangement to nullify Barrett's claim until I can get these documents to an honest judge in Cheyenne, or even back east." She looked him directly in the eye, her pride and her desperation warring within her. "Will you be my husband for one day, Jonah Pike, for one day, or for however long it takes to see me safe and the truth heard?" The question hung in the air, audacious and insane. Jonah stared at her as if she had suddenly grown a second head. He was utterly, profoundly stunned. The silence stretched, broken only by the soft snort of the mule. He took a step back, the lantern swinging and casting wild shadows on the rough-hewn walls of the barn. His hand went instinctively to his neck, his fingers closing around the hard, familiar shape of the iron ring beneath his shirt. Marriage. The word was a ghost that had not been spoken in his presence for 15 years. It tasted of ash and memory, of a life he had buried so deep he sometimes wondered if it had ever been real. He had made a vow over a cold grave, a vow of solitude, a promise to the memory of his wife and son that he would never again risk that kind of connection, that kind of loss. And now this woman, this city woman with her fierce eyes and her impossible courage, was asking him to shatter that vow. Not for love, not for companionship, but as a legal strategy, it was the most absurd and the most logical thing he had ever heard. He looked at her, truly looked at her. She was not a damsel in distress. She was a fighter, cornered and desperate, using the only weapon she had left, her mind. She was asking him to lend her his name, to stand as a legal barrier between her and the wolf at her heels. It was a continuation of the choice he had already made back in his cabin. He had chosen to protect her. This was simply a different kind of protection. It wasn't about rifles. It was about statutes. It was about fighting her enemy on his own ground. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. "Because I trust you," she said simply. "You are the only man I have met in a long time whose actions are not governed by money or ambition. You saved us when you had no reason to. You protected us when it would have been easier not to. I am not asking for your heart, Mr. Pike. I am asking for your honor." Her words struck a chord deep within him, a place he thought had long since gone silent. Honor. It was a word he had once lived by, and a word he had come to the mountains to forget. He thought of Caleb, sleeping soundly in the loft, a boy who looked at him with uncomplicated heroism. What kind of man would he be in that boy's eyes if he turned away now? He let out a long, slow breath, his decision solidifying like ice on a winter pond. It was madness. It broke every rule he had set for himself, but it was the right thing to do. "One day," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "or as long as it takes." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The ceremony was held the next evening in Ruth Henderson's main room. There were no flowers, no music, no fine clothes. The only guests were the flickering shadows cast by a single storm lantern on the table. The only minister was Ruth herself, who, as a respected midwife and elder, was considered a legitimate witness for common law declarations on the frontier. She had handwritten a simple document on a piece of ledger paper asterisk. On this day, before me, Ruth Henderson, a witness of the community. Jonah Pike and Evelyn Hart do declare themselves to be man and wife, bound by mutual consent and for mutual protection. Asterisk. Jonah stood beside Evelyn, feeling awkward and out of place, as if he were wearing another man's clothes. He had spent the afternoon at a small, makeshift forge behind Ruth's barn. He had taken the iron ring from around his neck, the cold metal a familiar weight in his palm. With Ruth's tools, he had heated it in the coals, the fire softening the metal that had been hardened by memory and grief. He cut the simple band and carefully, painstakingly, hammered it into two smaller, plain rings. They were rough, imperfect, and bore the scars of the fire and the hammer, much like the two people who were about to wear them. Now, he took one of the small, dark rings and looked at Evelyn in the warm lantern light. Her face was soft, her usual guarded expression replaced by a raw vulnerability. She met his gaze, her eyes dark and serious. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then took her left hand. Her fingers were cold. He slid the simple iron band onto her finger. It looked stark and out of place against her pale skin. She took the other ring and did the same for him. His hand was rough and calloused, but her touch was surprisingly steady. They both signed the paper, their signatures stark and clear beneath the lamplight. Caleb, who had been woken for the occasion, signed as a second witness, his young face a mixture of confusion and solemn awe. "It's done," Ruth said quietly, blotting the ink. "May God grant you both the strength for what comes next." After Ruth and Caleb had retired, a profound and heavy silence settled over the room. They were husband and wife, a legal fiction, a strategic maneuver, yet the words, once spoken, had a weight of their own. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were a unit, bound by a promise made in the flickering light. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. She was looking at the rough iron ring on her finger. Jonah merely nodded, unable to find words. He felt the matching ring on his own hand, a strange and foreign weight. He had replaced a symbol of his past with a symbol of this unbelievable present. Without thinking, he reached out, his calloused hand gently touching her arm. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, a small, involuntary movement. He drew her into a hesitant embrace. It wasn't a hug of passion, but of solidarity. Two shipwrecked survivors clinging to the same piece of wreckage. He could feel the slight tremor running through her. He held her for a long moment, the scent of her hair of soap and wood smoke filling his senses. When they drew apart, their faces were very close. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else. A deep well of sorrow he recognized because he carried one just like it inside himself. "My husband, Robert," she said, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it. "He died of a fever 2 years ago. He was a good man, kind, but he saw the world through hopeful eyes. He trusted men like Barrett." Jonah's throat felt tight. "My wife, Sarah, and our boy, a fever, just after the war." The words were stones he hadn't dislodged in 15 years. Saying them aloud felt like a betrayal and a relief all at once. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I swore I would never—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "Me too," he said gruffly. "I swore I'd never be responsible for anyone again." They stood there in the quiet intimacy of shared loss, the space between them charged with the ghosts of the people they had loved and failed to save. This strange contract, born of desperation, had unexpectedly become a confession. A gentle kiss, as soft as a moth's wing, passed between them. It was a kiss of comfort, not desire, a sealing of their pact, acknowledging the shared pain that, for the first time, made them feel a little less alone. The single day she had asked for had already become something more. It was no longer just a legal maneuver. It was a promise, forged in a lantern's glow and sealed with the memories of the dead. It was a promise to protect, to stand together, until the truth was finally brought into the light, and in the heart of the vast, cold Wyoming wilderness. That small, flickering hope felt more real than anything else in the world. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 4, Trial by Fire, the Wilderness, the Hunt, and the Cracks within asterisk, asterisk. They left the cabin like thieves in the night, melting into the pre-dawn darkness just moments after Deputy Bradley's warning had faded into the whispering pines. There was no time for sentiment, no looking back. The cabin, which had been a sanctuary, was now a trap. Every shadow seemed to hold the glint of a rifle barrel. Every snap of a frozen twig sounded like the cocking of a hammer. Jonah led the way, his mule job laden with their meager supplies, his own steps sure and silent on the frosted ground. Evelyn and Caleb followed on their remaining horse, the boy riding behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist for warmth and stability. Their destination was a name, a Hope Ruth Henderson's homestead, accessible only through the treacherous maw of Old Crow Pass. The climb began in earnest as the first hint of a gray, unforgiving dawn touched the highest peaks. The pass was less a trail and more a scar on the face of the mountain, a narrow, winding path that clung to the side of a steep canyon. The wind, funneled between the rock walls, was a physical blow, relentless and freighted with the promise of more snow. Evelyn felt a familiar dread creeping in. She was a liability. Her city clothes, though made of the finest wool, were no match for this brutal cold. Caleb, though brave, was still just a boy. She glanced at Jonah's back. He moved with the mountain, a part of its harsh, unyielding landscape. She felt a desperate need to not slow him down, to not be the anchor that dragged them all to their doom. The fear of being a burden was a colder, more insidious enemy than the wind itself. Hours later, the promised snow began. It came not as gentle flakes, but as a driving, horizontal blizzard that reduced visibility to a few feet. The world shrank to a churning vortex of white. They were forced to dismount and lead the horse, a single struggling entity against the full fury of the storm. "We need to find cover." Jonah's voice was a raw shout, barely audible over the gale. "There's an overhang a quarter-mile ahead." It was then that they heard it, a sound that cut through the storm's howl, high and lonely and filled with a chilling hunger. A wolf. It was answered by another, closer this time. They were being shadowed. The storm had made them vulnerable, and the pack was closing in, patient hunters sensing an opportunity. Caleb's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Evelyn put a reassuring hand on his arm, though her own heart was hammering against her ribs. Jonah stopped, his head cocked, listening. He unslung his rifle, the oiled steel a dark, comforting line against the snow. They'll keep their distance for now. Fire scares them, but they'll follow. They'll wait for one of us to fall. His words hung in the air, a grim prophecy. They pushed on, the howls a constant, unnerving chorus at the edge of their hearing. The path grew steeper, slick with a fresh layer of ice beneath the snow. It was on a particularly treacherous switchback that it happened. The horse, its shod hooves struggling for purchase, slipped. Caleb, holding the reins, was jerked off his feet. He cried out, not in pain but in surprise, as he slid down a short, rocky embankment, his leg twisting awkwardly beneath him before he came to a stop in a deep snowdrift. Jonah was at his side in an instant, his rifle at the ready, scanning the swirling snow for gray shapes. Evelyn scrambled down after him, her skirts tearing on the sharp rocks. "I'm all right," Caleb insisted, trying to get up, but a sharp grimace of pain contorted his face. His pant leg was torn at the calf, and a dark stain was already spreading through the fabric. Jonah helped him up. "Can you walk?" Caleb tried, but his leg buckled. I think so, but the lie was plain on his face. "We can't stay here," Jonah said, his voice tight, his eyes darting toward the rocks above. He looked at Caleb's leg, then at the horse, then at the impossible trail ahead. For the first time, Evelyn saw a flicker of something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, the stark fear of a man trapped by his own history of loss. He was terrified of losing the boy. Before he could speak, Evelyn took control. "Help me get him to that flat rock," she commanded, her voice calm and authoritative. "Jonah, keep watch. I'll see to the wound." Jonah hesitated, surprised by her tone, but he obeyed. He helped Caleb to the relative shelter of a granite boulder while Evelyn knelt, pulling a small knife from her satchel. She slit the boy's pant leg open. The gash was deep, oozing blood onto the pristine snow, but it had missed the bone. Without a moment's hesitation, she ripped a long, clean strip from her wool petticoat. She then unstoppered the small flask of whiskey her late husband had always insisted she carry for medicinal purposes. "This will sting, Caleb," she said softly, her eyes meeting the boy's. He nodded bravely. She poured a small amount of the liquor directly into the wound, and Caleb hissed in pain but didn't cry out. She then bound the leg tightly, her hands moving with a swift, practiced efficiency that spoke of more than just finishing school lessons. Jonah watched, his rifle held loosely in his hands. This was not the fragile city woman he had rescued from the snow. This was someone else, someone with a core of steel he hadn't anticipated. She was not a burden. She was a partner. As she finished tying the knot, a low rumble started from high above them, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the soles of their boots. It grew into a deafening roar. In Rockslide, Jonah yelled, grabbing Evelyn and Caleb and pulling them tight against the face of the boulder. The world dissolved into a thundering chaos of snow, ice, and stone. Boulders the size of barrels crashed down the mountainside, obliterating the path they had just taken and the one that lay ahead. When the roar finally subsided, replaced by the eerie whisper of the wind, they looked up. Their way forward was completely gone, buried under a massive, impassable wall of rubble. They were trapped. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Far behind them, a man named Kane Morrison knelt in the snow, examining the tracks leading away from Jonah Pike's cabin. He was a lean, wiry man with eyes the color of a frozen lake, and he missed nothing. He noted the tracks of 3 people, 1 mule, 1 horse. He noted the depth of the prints, calculating their pace. Barrett Sloane paid well, but more than that, Kane enjoyed the hunt. He saw the faint, almost invisible scrape marks near the tree line. "Headed for Old Crow," he muttered to the 2 Pinkerton agents with him. "The fool's taking them the hard way." He smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his weathered face. "Good. The hard way has fewer places to hide." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Despair, cold and sharp, settled over Evelyn. They were cut off, with an injured boy and a pack of wolves shadowing their every move. She looked at Jonah. His face was a grim mask, his jaw set like granite. "There's a hunter's ledge about 500 feet up," he said, his voice strained. "It's a hard climb, maybe impossible with the boy's leg." His gaze was fixed on the sheer rock face. He was calculating the odds, and they were not good. He was seeing it happen all over again, people he was responsible for, slipping through his fingers. "No," Evelyn said, her voice sharp. Jonah turned to her, his frustration evident. "There is no other way. Woman, do you want to stay here and wait for the wolves or Sloane's men?" "I am not a fool. Mr. Pike," she shot back, her own fear and frustration boiling over into anger. "And I will not have you risk your life on an impossible climb because you think Caleb and I are helpless baggage. There is another way." He stared at her, incredulous. "I have walked these mountains for 15 years. There is no other way." "You've walked them as a trapper," she retorted, her hands going to her precious leather satchel. I know them as a miner's wife." She unfastened the clasps and pulled out, not the oilskin bundle of trust documents, but a long, rolled-up tube of waxed canvas. She spread it on a flat, snow-dusted rock. It was a geological survey map, intricately detailed with contour lines, mineral seams, and elevation markers. It depicted the heart-consolidated silver claim, an ambitious but ultimately failed venture her husband had sunk a fortune into years ago. Robert was convinced there was a mother lode in this very canyon. She explained, her finger tracing a line on the yellowed paper. "We are here." Her finger tapped a point perilously close to the edge of the claim. "Your trail is gone. But look." She pointed to a series of small, dotted lines and symbols that Jonah's hand-drawn map had omitted. "This is a ventilation shaft for the main tunnel. It's collapsed, according to this survey. But here this was a mule track, used to haul out ore from a test pit. It cuts straight through the mountain to the eastern slope. It should come out less than a mile from where we need to be." Jonah bent over the map, his skepticism warring with a dawning respect. The detail was incredible. He knew this land like the back of his hand. But this map showed him its bones, its guts. He looked from the symbols on the paper to the rock face, his experienced eyes translating the drawing into a three-dimensional reality. He could see it now, a slight depression in the rock, almost completely obscured by snow, that could mark the entrance to the old track. It was a long shot. The track could be collapsed, washed out, a dead end. But it was a chance. The argument had bled the anger out of them, leaving behind a raw, exposed honesty. He was no longer just the protector, and she no longer the protected. They were two experts, pooling their knowledge to survive. "All right, Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice softer now, using her formal name with a new kind of deference. "We'll try your way." They found the entrance half hidden behind a curtain of icicles. It was narrow and dark, but the ground was stable. They moved through the mountain's cold heart, the sounds of the storm fading behind them. After a tense hour, they emerged onto the eastern slope. The wind lessened, the snow falling more gently. They had done it. Below them, tucked into a fold of the hills, was a small, sheltered cave, marked by a faded pictograph of a soaring eagle, an old Ute shelter. Inside, out of the wind, they finally rested. Jonah built a small, smokeless fire of dry aspen wood, its warmth a blessing on their frozen limbs. As the light of the fire danced on the cave walls, they sat in a comfortable silence, a new understanding between them. He had seen her strength, and she had seen the fear behind his stoicism. The rigid lines that had defined them mountain man and city lady had blurred, washed away by the storm and the shared terror. At dawn, the blizzard had passed. The air was clean and cold, the new fallen snow a blanket of impossible beauty. As Jonah stood at the mouth of the cave, scanning the valley below, he suddenly went still. He lifted a hand, pointing. Evelyn and Caleb joined him, far away, on a distant ridge that seemed to float in the morning mist. A thin plume of smoke rose into the sky. It vanished, then appeared again, and then a third time. 3 distinct puffs. Caleb looked confused, but Evelyn saw the tension drain from Jonah's shoulders, replaced by a look of profound relief. "It's Ruth," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's a signal. She's watching for us. She's telling us the trail from here is clear." The smoke signal was more than just a message. It was a lifeline. It was a sign that they were not alone in this wilderness, that there was a network of decent folk, a community of souls bound by an unwritten code of loyalty and mutual aid. It was a promise of sanctuary. They packed their few belongings, a shared purpose uniting them, as they prepared to make the final descent toward the Henderson homestead. Evelyn looked at Jonah and Caleb, their faces illuminated by the morning sun. The crucible of the pass had melted them down and forged them into something new. They were not yet a family, but they were no longer just survivors. They were a unit, bound by the fire they had walked through together. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 5, Where Law and Justice Collide. Asterisk, asterisk. The Henderson homestead was not a fortress, but it felt like one, guided by the memory of the smoke signal. They descended from the high country into a wide, sheltered valley where the wind's bite was softened by thick stands of aspen and pine. The log house was long and low, anchored to the earth, with a wide porch and a stone chimney breathing a steady plume of welcome smoke. A large barn, corrals, and several outbuildings spoke of a life of hard work and deep-rooted permanence. This was a place built to endure. As they rode into the main yard, the front door opened, and Ruth Henderson emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. She was not alone. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and her same sharp eyes stood beside her, her son, Jim. 3 younger versions of him, his sons, materialized from the barn, their initial curiosity hardening into watchful appraisal as they took in the strangers. "About time you got here," Ruth said, her tone a mixture of relief and scolding. "We've been keeping the coffee hot for 2 days." There was no flurry of questions, just a calm, capable acceptance of their arrival. Caleb was immediately taken inside, his leg examined by Ruth with a practiced, no-nonsense touch. He was pronounced to be on the mend, needing only rest and hot food. Evelyn was led to a simple, clean room with a handmade quilt on the bed. The quiet, the safety, the simple human kindness were so overwhelming that she had to sit on the edge of the bed for a long moment, just to keep from weeping. Over the next few hours, the homestead transformed into a gathering point. A rider was dispatched and returned with Marcus Stone, the owner of a small trading post 20 miles south. He was a man in his 50s with a ramrod-straight posture and a quiet authority that spoke of his past as a cavalry officer. He greeted Jonah with a firm handshake and a nod of mutual respect. Later, 2 Ute men arrived on horseback, their faces impassive. They spoke in low tones with Jim Henderson, sharing a pipe before settling near the barn, their presence a silent declaration of allegiance. Evelyn watched from the porch as this quiet militia assembled. These people were not bound by law or contract, but by something stronger: community. They were drawing a line in the snow, declaring the Henderson homestead sovereign ground, a sanctuary for those who sought its protection. Jonah stood with Marcus and Jim, speaking in low, serious tones. He was no longer just a solitary mountain man, here among his peers. He was a respected member of that invisible network, a man whose word carried weight. He caught her eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, asterisk, "You are safe here." The fragile peace was shattered in the late afternoon by the arrival of 4 riders. Sheriff Cole was in the lead, a tall man whose face was a study in conflict. The star on his chest seemed to weigh him down. Beside him was Deputy Bradley, his expression grim and determined. He carefully avoided looking in Jonah's direction. "Jonah," the sheriff said, his voice heavy as he dismounted. "Ruth, I'm sorry to bring this trouble to your door, but I've got a lawful warrant here." "A piece of paper signed by a crooked judge doesn't make it lawful." "Sam," Ruth retorted, stepping onto the porch, her arms crossed, "it just makes it paper." Sheriff Cole had the decency to look ashamed. "My hands are tied. Barrett Sloan is 10 minutes behind me. He's invoked the warrant and demanded I escort Mrs. Hart back to Argent to await the circuit judge." "His name is Jonah Pike now," Evelyn said, her voice clear and steady as she stepped forward to stand beside Ruth. The simple iron ring on her finger felt as heavy and strong as a shield. "I am Mrs. Evelyn Pike, and according to the law you hold so dear. Sheriff, a wife's place is with her husband. This is my husband. This is my home." The sheriff was taken aback, his eyes flicking from the ring on her finger to Jonah's impassive face. "Jonah, is this true?" "We made our declaration before a community witness. Jonah stated, his voice a low rumble. It's as legal as any preacher's word in this territory. Sheriff Cole ran a hand over his weary face. The situation had just become exponentially more complicated. He was no longer dealing with a lone woman, but a homesteader and his wife, surrounded by their neighbors. Before he could formulate a response, the rest of the party arrived. Barrett Sloan rode into the yard as if he owned it, a satisfied smirk on his face. He was flanked by the rail-thin, dangerous form of Kane Morrison and two hard-faced Pinkerton agents. They reined in their horses, a phalanx of tailored wool and menace. But it was the fifth rider who made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat. Riding slightly behind her father was a young woman of about 18. Her face pale and her eyes downcast, Catherine Sloan. "Sheriff," Barrett boomed, his voice oozing false cordiality. "I see you found my runaway ward and the man who aided her in her confusion." He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the assembled homesteaders with contempt. "This is a simple matter of law. I am her legal guardian, and I am here to take her, and the boy she abducted, home." He strode toward the porch. Jonah moved to block his path, a silent, immovable obstacle. "Her name is Mrs. Pike," Jonah said, his voice flat and cold, "and she is already home." Barrett's smirk faltered, replaced by a sneer. "Pike, don't be absurd. A desperate ploy. This mountain mummer's trick won't stand up in any real court." He held out the warrant to the sheriff. "Do your duty, Cole, or I'll have your badge for obstruction." The yard was taut with a silence that was about to break. Kane Morrison's hand rested casually on the butt of his pistol. Jim Henderson and his sons had subtly positioned themselves near the barn, their own rifles in hand. Marcus Stone stood like a statue, his old cavalry instincts assessing angles and threats. It was into this standoff that Catherine Sloan stepped. She dismounted, her movements stiff and uncertain. She clutched a leather-bound book to her chest, a family Bible. Evelyn realized. "Father," Catherine said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost. "Not now." "Catherine," Barrett snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "Go wait by the horses. This is business for men." "No," she said, and this time her voice was stronger, imbued with a desperate clarity. "This is my business, too." She walked forward, past the tense figures of Jonah and her father, and stopped in the middle of the yard, directly in front of Sheriff Cole. The wooden table on the porch, laden with coffee cups and a plate of Ruth's biscuits, suddenly felt like a judge's bench. All eyes were on her. "Sheriff Cole," she began, her voice trembling but resolute, "the warrant my father carries is based on a foundation of lies." Barrett's face contorted with rage. "Catherine, you don't know what you're talking about. Go to the horse, now." She ignored him, her gaze locked on the sheriff. "My father claims Mrs. Pike embezzled funds from her late husband's estate. That is untrue. In fact, my father's own mining ventures are bankrupt. He has been insolvent for 6 months." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Barrett took a threatening step toward her, but Marcus Stone moved, almost casually, to a position between them. Catherine opened the Bible she was holding. Tucked between the pages were not scriptures, but folded legal papers and letters. She carefully extracted a sheaf of documents, their edges sealed with wax. "These are copies of ledgers from my father's own office," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word. "I have been keeping his books for the past year. They show debts of over $100,000. He has lost everything." She then held up a letter, written in a fine, elegant hand. "And this is a letter he wrote to his lawyer in Denver, which I found in his desk. In it, he outlines his plan. He details his intent to force a marriage to Mrs. Pike for the sole purpose of gaining legal control over the trust fund of her sister, Lily Hart, which he describes as his only path to financial salvation." She handed the entire stack of papers to the stunned sheriff. "The woman you are here to arrest is the victim of a conspiracy. Sheriff, my father is not her protector. He is a predator, using the law as his weapon because he has lost all his money and all his honor? Barrett Sloane was apoplectic, his face a mask of purple fury. She's a hysterical child lying to protect this thief. I am 18 years old. Father, Catherine said, turning to face him for the first time, her eyes blazing with a courage that seemed to have been forged in that very moment. I am a legal adult, and I will not be a party to your crimes. She turned back to the sheriff. Sir, I wish to file a petition for emancipation. I can no longer, in good conscience, live under the authority of a man who would perpetrate such a fraud. The truth, stark and undeniable, lay on the table. The wax seals, the cold, hard numbers in the ledgers, the damning words in her father's own hand. They were a weapon more powerful than any gun. Deputy Bradley, who had been standing silently behind the sheriff, took a half-step forward, his hand now resting on his own pistol, his eyes fixed not on Jonah, but on Kane Morrison. The lines had been redrawn. Sheriff Cole looked down at the papers in his hand, then at Barrett Sloane's sputtering rage, and finally at Catherine's pale, determined face. He was no longer a man trapped between duty and conscience. Catherine's brave act had given him a third path, the path of justice. He carefully folded the documents and tucked them into his coat pocket. He looked Barrett Sloane directly in the eye, and the weight on his shoulders seemed to lift. Barrett, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority that silenced the entire yard. These are serious allegations, criminal allegations. They cast your civil warrant into a very different light. He took the warrant from Sloane's stunned hand and tore it neatly in half. This warrant is null and void, the sheriff declared, and you and your men will leave the Henderson property immediately. A full investigation into these matters will commence in the morning. Barrett Sloane stood there, his power and his plans shattered by the one person he had never considered a threat. His own daughter. The law he had so expertly twisted to his purpose had just been turned back on him, not by a loophole or a clever lawyer, but by the simple, devastating power of the truth. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 6, the high-stakes climax, a debt paid in truth, asterisk, asterisk. For a long, frozen moment, the only sound in the Henderson yard was the low moan of the wind stirring dustings of snow from the barn roof. Sheriff Cole's torn warrant lay in two pieces on the hard-packed earth, a declaration that the flimsy shield of corrupt law had been broken. Barrett Sloane stood exposed, stripped of his authority and his dignity by his own daughter's courage. His face, which had been a mask of purple fury, slowly drained of color, leaving behind the pallid, waxy sheen of pure desperation. He was a cornered animal, and the most dangerous moment is when the trap has sprung. His eyes, small and venomous, darted around the yard. He saw the grim, unyielding faces of the homesteaders. He saw the newfound resolve in Sheriff Cole's posture. He saw his entire world, built on a foundation of intimidation and deceit, crumbling to dust. And then his gaze fell on Jonah Pike, the silent, immovable object that had started this avalanche. All his ruin, all his humiliation. He laid at this one man's feet. The civility, thin as it was, vanished completely. "Morrison," Barrett snarled, his voice a low, vicious rasp that cut through the cold air. "That man is obstructing justice. Remove him. Get me the woman, now." It was not a request. It was the unleashing of a dog. Kane Morrison had been waiting for this. He was a creature of simple transactions, and his payment was contingent on a result. His hand, which had been resting near his pistol, became a blur of motion. Leather slapped against his thigh as he drew his Colt Peacemaker, the click of the hammer being pulled back unnaturally loud in the tense silence. But the world did not move at the speed of one man's gun. As Morrison's pistol cleared the holster, the yard exploded into a dozen simultaneous actions. Deputy Bradley, his face set in a hard line, drew his own weapon, shouting, "No Marcus Stone." The old cavalryman moved with an economy born of 100 skirmishes. his hand already on the revolver tucked in his belt. Jim Henderson and his sons raised their rifles, the muzzles appearing like dark, accusing eyes from the barn's shadows. Jonah, however, did not reach for the rifle leaning against the porch post. He was the target, the epicenter of the violence, and he was too close for a long gun. In the split second that Morrison's pistol was rising, Jonah moved with a speed that was utterly at odds with his size. He didn't charge forward, he pivoted, taking 2 swift, powerful strides not toward his enemy, but toward his mule. Job, the ever-patient beast, stood tethered to the corral, and tied to his saddle was a long, leather-wrapped object. Jonah's hand closed around it, ripping it free. The worn leather scabbard fell away, revealing a length of scarred, pitted steel, a model 1860 light cavalry saber. The afternoon's gray light glinted dully on the curved blade, etched near the hilt, faint but still visible. Was his unit designation *2nd Colo, Cav. The weight of it in his hand was a ghost. It was the weight of shouting and cannon fire, of the acrid smell of gunpowder, of the faces of men he had cut down in the terrible calculus of war. A vow, made over the graves of his wife and son, echoed in the deepest part of his mind. A promise sworn in agony, no more killing. This was not a weapon of malice. It was a tool, and he would use it as a surgeon uses a scalpel to cut away the sickness, not to butcher the patient. All of this happened in the space of a single heartbeat. Morrison's gun roared, the sound a flat, brutal crack that sent a flock of birds scattering from the eaves of the barn. The bullet, fired in haste, went wide, splintering the porch railing inches from where Evelyn stood. From the doorway of the cabin, Caleb had been watching, his face a mask of awe and terror. He saw the flash of the gun, saw the wood explode next to Evelyn. In that instant, the boy who had learned to read tracks and split wood ceased to exist. In his place was a young man acting on a pure, protective instinct that was as deep and fierce as Jonah's own. Without a thought for himself, he lunged forward, throwing himself in front of Evelyn, his arms spread as if to shield her with his own small body. A second shot rang out, this one from one of Barrett's Pinkerton agents. A panicked, unaimed discharge into the general chaos. This bullet found a mark. It tore through the thick wool of Caleb's sleeve, scoring a hot, bloody furrow along his shoulder before burying itself in the log wall behind him. Caleb cried out, a sharp gasp of pain and shock, and staggered back into Evelyn. She caught him, her mind reeling, her hands coming away from his shoulders slick with blood. Caleb! Her scream was one of pure terror, a sound that cut through the noise of the fight. Jonah saw it all. He saw the boy fall, saw the crimson stain spreading on his shirt. A cold, controlled rage descended upon him, a fury purified of all heat. He closed the distance between himself and Morrison in 3 long, silent strides. The gunman, surprised by the saber and distracted by the chaos, tried to bring his weapon around for another shot. He was fast, but Jonah was a force of nature. The saber did not swing in a wide, decapitating arc. It moved in a tight, precise snap from the wrist. There was a sharp, ringing clang of steel striking steel. The heavy Colt was ripped from Kane Morrison's grasp, spinning end over end through the air before landing with a thud in the snow-dusted dirt. Morrison stared at his empty, stinging hand in disbelief. Before he could recover, Jonah reversed the saber, the heavy brass pommel leading. He drove it forward, not into Morrison's face, but into his solar plexus. The blow landed with a sickening thud, driving the air from the gunman's lungs in a pained whoosh. Morrison collapsed to his knees, gasping like a landed fish, all the fight gone out of him. The 2 Pinkerton agents, seeing their hired gun neutralized and now facing a yard full of determined, armed men and the law, made a swift and professional decision. They dropped their pistols and raised their hands high in the air. The entire violent encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Morrison's ragged gasping and Caleb's pained whimpers as Ruth and Evelyn guided him into a chair on the porch. The sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder hung in the cold, thin air. Sheriff Cole holstered his pistol, his face grim. The choice had been made for him. He strode over to Barrett Sloane, who stood frozen, his face a mask of utter ruin. "Barrett Sloane," the sheriff said, his voice hard and clear, ringing with the authority he had finally claimed. "I am arresting you on suspicion of conspiracy, fraud, and incitement to violence." He pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. Deputy Bradley, his own pistol now aimed squarely at the kneeling Morrison, moved in to cuff the gunman. "You have the right to remain silent, Mr. Morrison," Bradley said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. As the sheriff clamped the cuffs on Sloane's wrists, Catherine watched, tears streaming silently down her face. They were tears of grief for the father she had lost long before this day, and tears of relief for the terrible future she had just averted. Jonah stood over the defeated Morrison, the saber held loosely at his side. He looked at the blade, at the faint traces of rust near the hilt, at the memories it held. Then he looked over at the porch. He saw Evelyn, her face pale with fear, tearing a strip from her dress to help Ruth bind Caleb's shoulder. He saw the boy, gritting his teeth against the pain. But his eyes, when they met Jonah's, were shining with a fierce, unwavering pride. He had stood his ground. He had protected his own. In that moment, in that baptism of fear and fire, Caleb Finch had become Caleb Pike in all but name. Slowly, deliberately, Jonah slid the cavalry saber back into its scabbard. The sound of the steel sheathing itself was quiet, but final. He had faced the ghost of his own violence and had not succumbed to it. He had used his strength not to destroy, but to disarm. The vow he had made to the dead had been tested, and it had held. A hero, he was beginning to understand, was not the man who was quickest to draw his sword. He was the man who knew, with absolute certainty, when it was time to put it away. Asterisk, asterisk. Part 7. The curtain falls, a real wedding, a chosen family, asterisk, asterisk. The departure of Sheriff Cole's posse left a silence in the yard that was deeper than the one that had preceded it. The trampled snow, the discarded warrant, the dark, drying stain where Caleb's blood had fallen, they were the only remnants of the storm that had broken over them. As the figures of the lawmen and their prisoners dwindled into dark specks against the vast, white landscape, the tension that had held the homestead in its grip for hours finally snapped. Jim Henderson and his sons lowered their rifles. Marcus Stone let out a long, slow breath. The Ute men, who had watched the entire affair with an unnerving stillness, gave a single, brief nod to Jonah before mounting their horses and melting back into the trees. The militia became neighbors again. In the center of it all, Catherine Sloane stood alone, a solitary, tragic figure. She watched the riders disappear, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask. She had saved them all, but in doing so, had severed the final, frayed cord that bound her to her old life. She was adrift. It was Ruth Henderson who went to her, placing a rough, warm hand on the young woman's shoulder. "You have a place here, child," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "For as long as you need one." Catherine looked up. Her eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it left no room for words. She simply nodded, a sob catching in her throat, and allowed the older woman to lead her inside, into the warmth and the quiet promise of a new beginning. The winter that followed was long and hard, but inside the Hendersons' orbit, it was a time of healing. Caleb's shoulder mended, the clean wound leaving a scar he would carry as a badge of honor. He spent his days helping Jim and his sons with the endless chores of a winter-bound homestead, his body growing stronger, his face losing the last vestiges of boyhood anxiety. He was quiet, but he watched everything, absorbing the rhythms of a life lived in partnership with the land. Catherine, after a period of quiet grief, found her own purpose. She possessed a fine education, a rarity in this isolated valley, and she began giving lessons to the Henderson boys in the evenings, their heads bent together over worn books by the light of the fire. The act of teaching, of giving something of herself, seemed to stitch her wounded soul back together. For Jonah and Evelyn, it was a time of quiet, unspoken adjustment. They were husband and wife by a slip of paper, allies by circumstance now, in the forced intimacy of the long winter nights. They began to learn the landscape of each other. There were no grand declarations, only the slow, steady accumulation of small moments. He saw the keen intelligence in her eyes as she helped Ruth with the mending, her stitches small and perfect. He noticed how she listened more than she spoke, her quiet observations often cutting to the heart of a matter. She, in turn, saw the gentleness in his large, calloused hands as he carved a toy horse for the youngest Henderson boy. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his silence, the easy quiet of contentment, the heavy quiet of a man wrestling with his ghosts. They rarely spoke of the future, or of the past. Their conversation was rooted in the present, the depth of the snow, the health of the livestock, the dwindling supply of firewood. They slept in separate rooms, a respectful distance maintained between them. Yet, a bond was growing, woven not of passion, but of shared hardship and a profound, mutual respect. The iron rings on their fingers were a constant, physical reminder of the pact they had made, a pact that was slowly, imperceptibly, turning from a legal strategy into a simple truth. When the first thaws of spring finally came, the world was transformed. The oppressive silence of winter was broken by the gurgle of melting snow and the rush of newly freed creeks. The air grew soft and smelled of damp earth and possibility. With the melting of the snow came a restlessness, a need to build. Jonah announced one morning that he was returning to his cabin. "It needs work," was all he said. "A new porch. The roof needs patching." There was no question that Evelyn and Caleb would go with him. The Henderson homestead had been a generous sanctuary, but the cabin in the high valley was home. They journeyed back not as fugitives, but as a family returning. The trail that had been a path of terror was now just a path, winding through hillsides dotted with the first, brave shoots of green. Life fell into a new rhythm, one of work and creation. Jonah, with help from Jim Henderson, who rode up once a week, began felling logs for a new, wider porch that would face the morning sun. He worked with a focused intensity, the rhythmic bite of his axe a sound of purpose echoing through the valley. Evelyn, with Caleb's help, cleared a patch of ground near the cabin, turning over the dark, rich soil. She had sent a letter and a bank draft with a traveling tinker, and weeks later, a crate arrived from Cheyenne containing seeds, tools, and a small, sapling apple tree. She and Caleb spent their days digging, planting, and tending to their nascent garden, their hands in the dirt, coaxing life from the earth. It was during this time that the unspoken became spoken. One afternoon, while they were repairing a stretch of fence, Caleb looked up at Jonah, who was showing him how to properly set a post. "Folks are calling me Caleb Finch," the boy said quietly, not looking at Jonah, "but it don't feel right, not anymore." Jonah stopped his work, leaning on the post driver. He looked at the boy, at the serious set of his jaw, at the scar that peeked from the collar of his shirt. He saw the young man who had thrown himself in front of a bullet for Evelyn. "A man's name is his own to choose," Jonah said, his voice gruff with an emotion he didn't know how to express. "If you've a mind to, the name Pike is a good, sturdy name. It's been known to hold fast in hard ground." A slow, brilliant smile spread across Caleb's face. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He simply picked up his hammer and drove the next fence staple home with a solid, satisfying thud. From that day forward, he was Caleb Pike. The conversation about their own status came just as quietly. They were sitting on the half-finished porch one evening, watching the last rays of sun paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. The air was cool and smelled of freshly cut pine. "That paper Ruth wrote," Evelyn said softly, turning the iron ring on her finger. "It served its purpose, but it feels temporary, like a shelter for a storm that has already passed." Jonah looked at her. In the soft twilight, her face was stripped of the hardness and fear that had been her constant companions. He saw the woman she was meant to be: strong, intelligent, and possessed of a quiet, deep-running warmth. He thought of the long, lonely years in his cabin, the silence that had once been a comfort but now felt like an absence. This woman, and the boy inside, had filled that silence with life. "A home needs a proper foundation. Evelyn," he said. His use of her first name was as natural as breathing, not a temporary one. There was no formal proposal, no bended knee. There was only a shared look of understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that what had begun as a contract for one day had become a desire for all the days to come. The second wedding took place on the first day of summer, in the yard of the now completed cabin. The new porch was decorated with wildflowers the Henderson boys had gathered. The entire community was there: Ruth and her family, Marcus Stone, even Deputy Bradley, who had ridden up from Argent on his own time. Catherine, her face bright and her smile genuine, stood beside Evelyn. A traveling preacher, his coat dusty and his face kind, performed the ceremony. As Jonah and Evelyn stood before him, the sun warm on their faces, they spoke the old, familiar vows. But for them, the words were not just tradition. They were a ratification of promises already kept, of a bond already forged in ice and fire. When Jonah slid the iron ring back onto her finger, it was no longer a symbol of a desperate pact, but of a deliberate, freely chosen future. That night, after their guests had departed, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. The storm lantern, which had once been their only beacon of hope in the frozen wilderness, now hung from a hook on the porch, its steady golden light pushing back the darkness. It was no longer a storm lantern. It was their porch light. It was the light of home. Inside, they sat before the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The awkwardness of their first days together was gone, replaced by a deep, comfortable intimacy. "I never properly thanked him," Evelyn said, her voice a near whisper. "My first husband, Robert, he was too trusting, too optimistic. But he was a good man. His memory deserves thanks for the happiness we had." Jonah reached out and took her hand. His was rough and scarred. Hers was slender and smooth, but they fit together perfectly. "I used to think that to be loyal to Sarah and my boy, I had to stay alone," he confessed, his voice thick, that bringing someone new into my life would be a betrayal of their memory. "But now I think the best way to honor the love you've lost is to dare to love again." He looked at her, his eyes clear and honest in the firelight. "Thank you, Sarah," he whispered, the words spoken not to Evelyn, but to the quiet, listening air. "For the son you gave me, for the love you taught me." They sat like that for a long time, their hands intertwined, their pasts finally at peace. They were two survivors, two souls who had been hollowed out by grief, who had somehow found their way back to life by finding each other. There were no passionate kisses, no grand embraces. There was only the profound, healing touch of a scarred hand holding another, a silent promise that neither of them would ever have to be alone again. A week later, a letter arrived, carried by the same tinker who had brought the seeds. It was from Boston, the envelope addressed in a fine, looping hand. It was from Lily. Evelyn read it aloud on the porch, her voice thick with emotion. Her sister was well, would be turning 18 in a matter of months, and had received word from Evelyn's lawyer in Denver. She knew everything. Asterisk. "Thank you, Evie." Asterisk, she had written. Asterisk. "Thank you for being brave when I could not. Thank you for saving my future." Asterisk. Evelyn folded the letter, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The original purpose of her desperate flight, the very reason she had ridden into the teeth of that blizzard, was fulfilled. Her sister was safe. Her duty was done. That afternoon, the three of them, Jonah, Evelyn, and Caleb, walked to the small garden. Together, they dug a hole in the rich, dark earth, and together, they planted the small apple tree, tamping the soil around its fragile roots. It was a small, hopeful-looking thing, a mere whip of a tree against the vast, rugged backdrop of the mountains. But its roots were in good soil. With care and time, it would grow strong. It would bear fruit. It was a promise, planted in the earth, of the family they had chosen, and the life they would build. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 10. Epilogue, A Light on the Mountain. Asterisk, asterisk. A year passes in the way of the mountains, measured not by the turning of a calendar's page, but by the rhythm of the seasons. Summer bled into a golden autumn, which gave way to a winter of deep, silent snows, and then burst forth again into a spring so vibrant it felt like the world was being born anew. The Pike homestead, as it was now known, settled into the landscape as if it had always been there. The raw, new-cut logs of the porch had weathered to a soft, silver gray. The apple tree, once a fragile whip, now had a sturdy trunk and a proud crown of glossy green leaves. Evelyn's garden was a riot of life, producing enough beans, squash, and potatoes to see them through the winter. With plenty left to share with the Hendersons, the cabin was no longer a lonely shelter. It was the warm, beating heart of a family. The changes in the people were just as profound. Caleb Pike, at 18, was a man. The lanky uncertainty of his youth had been replaced by the corded muscle and quiet confidence of a blacksmith. Marcus Stone, seeing the boy's aptitude, had taken him on as an apprentice, and Caleb spent 3 days a week at the trading post, his face smudged with soot, the ring of his hammer on the anvil a steady, purposeful song. He was creating things of use and strength: horseshoes, hinges, tools. He had found his place in the world not by running, but by standing still and learning a trade. Catherine Sloane, her petition for emancipation granted by a sympathetic judge, had found her own calling, with a small inheritance left to her by her mother, which her father had been unable to touch. She established a small school in a converted outbuilding on the Henderson homestead. She taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to the scattered children of the valley, her patient voice a beacon of knowledge in the vast wilderness. She was no longer defined by her father's sins, but by her own quiet, determined acts of creation. But the greatest transformation was in Jonah. The harsh, shuttered mask of the solitary man was gone, weathered away by the gentle, daily erosion of love and laughter. The silence he had once cultivated as a shield was now a comfortable peace, shared with his wife and son. He still spent long hours in the mountains, but now he returned with a purpose, his steps lighter, his eyes searching the valley for the site of his home. And now he had a new project. In the long evenings of late summer, as the light faded from the sky, he would sit on the porch, a piece of fine-grained pine across his lap. With a draw knife and a set of carving tools, he was crafting a cradle. Each curve, each joint, was a meditation. He was not just shaping wood, he was shaping a future. In the smooth, rocking motion of the runners, he was making peace with his past. This cradle was not a replacement for the one he had lost, but a continuation, a testament to the stubborn, resilient nature of hope. Evelyn would watch him, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. She was carrying their child, a new life conceived not in desperation, but in the quiet, steady love that had grown between them. She had found a strength in this life she had never known in the city, a resilience born of planting seeds and stacking firewood, of knowing that her survival and happiness depended not on a ledger book, but on the man sitting beside her and the boy who called them family. One afternoon, a rider from Argent brought the mail, a rare and welcome event. Among the letters was a thick envelope addressed to Jonah, bearing the official stamp of the Laramie County Sheriff's Office. They opened it together on the porch, Caleb and Catherine having ridden over for supper. It was a letter from Sheriff Cole. Asterisk Jonah. Asterisk it read, asterisk I thought you would want to know. The trial of Barrett Sloan concluded last week in Denver. He was found guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, witness tampering. The evidence provided by your wife and his daughter was irrefutable. He has been sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary. His assets have been seized to pay his creditors. It's over. Asterisk. A quiet sigh of relief passed through the small group. A long, dark chapter was finally closed. But there was more. Asterisk. As for Kane Morrison. Asterisk, the letter continued. Asterisk, he testified against Sloan and the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, detailing numerous cases of intimidation and illegal practices. In exchange for his testimony, he received a reduced sentence of 5 years. It's not perfect justice, I know, but it's a start. The agency is now under federal investigation. Your stand here in this valley has sent ripples farther than you can imagine. Asterisk. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the news. Justice was not a clean, perfect thing. It was messy, compromised, a series of small, hard-won victories. But it was real. Their fight had meant something. That evening, as if to wash the last remnants of the past away, a summer thunderstorm rolled down from the high peaks. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind rose, whipping the leaves of the aspen trees into a silver frenzy. Lightning cracked, illuminating the valley in brilliant, jagged flashes, followed by the deep, resonant boom of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. But they were not afraid. They were safe inside, the fire crackling in the hearth, the sturdy log walls holding the storm at bay, the porch lantern, their small, defiant beacon, swung in the wind but did not go out, its golden light a steady presence in the tumultuous dark. Jonah put the final touches on the cradle, rubbing it with beeswax until the wood glowed with a soft, warm luster. Evelyn sat nearby, mending a shirt for Caleb, her needle moving in a steady, peaceful rhythm. She looked up at Jonah, a soft, playful smile touching her lips. "You know," she said, her voice barely rising above the sound of the rain drumming on the roof. "A year ago, I was in a barn, in the dead of winter, desperately asking you to be my husband for just one day." Jonah stopped his work. He looked at her, at the firelight catching the soft curve of her cheek, at the life they had built together out of the wreckage of their pasts. He reached across and took her hand, his thumb stroking the simple iron ring that had started it all. "I believe I signed the ledger for a lifetime. Mrs. Pike," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "and I don't intend to break the contract." The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of rain and wet earth. The last of the thunder grumbled its way east, and a sliver of moon broke through the clouds, casting a silver sheen over the valley. Another letter had come with the sheriff's, this one from the east, addressed to Evelyn. She had saved it, as if for this very moment of peace. The three of them went out onto the damp porch, breathing in the clean night air, by the steady light of the lantern. Evelyn opened the envelope. It was from Lily. Asterisk, dearest Evie. Asterisk, she read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. Asterisk, my affairs here are settled, and I am of age. I have booked my passage west. I want to meet my new family. I want to see the place where you found your courage and your home. Asterisk. Evelyn paused, taking a breath. Asterisk. I will be arriving on the Union Pacific Line in Cheyenne on the 1st of September. Asterisk. She looked up, her eyes shining with tears of joy. Jonah put his arm around her, pulling her close. Caleb stood beside them, a wide grin on his face. In the far, far distance, beyond the dark shapes of the foothills, they could just make out a faint, silvery line glinting in the moonlight. It was the railroad, the twin steel ribbons that were stitching the nation together, relentlessly bringing the modern world, with all its promises and perils, closer every day. A year ago, that world had been a threat to be fled. Now, it was bringing them a sister. It was bringing them the future. They stood there together on the porch, the mountain man, the city lady, and the blacksmith's boy, a family forged in a blizzard and tempered by love. They had put down roots in the hard, stony ground of the mountains, roots that were now deep and strong. The world would continue to change. The railroad would bring more noise and more people, and there would be new struggles of drought and taxes, of progress and preservation. But they would face it all together. They were no longer running. They were home. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed our journey with Jonah and Evelyn, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And for extra support, hit that hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.